pulse of charitable giving in the United States. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicch. This is the first day from the Fundraising School. I'm joined today by Woodrow Rosenbaum. He is the Chief Data Officer for GivingTuesday, and he's using his considerable expertise in data collection and analysis to provide us with a useful tool for our fundraising planning. And Woodrow, thanks so much for being with us on the Fundraising Schools podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
So in addition to all that you're doing for GivingTuesday, in your spare time, you've created the GivingPulse. What is the GivingPulse?
So GivingPulse is our instrument to attempt to understand the full spectrum of human generosity right now, primarily in the U.S., all of the ways that people give in an up-to-date and timely way. So we're seeing these patterns on a weekly basis, hoping to give the nonprofit and the social sector more insights into how and why people are generous.
How are you gathering these data and from who?
So this is a representative sample that we take of U.S. adults every week. So every week we ask through a commercial marketing survey company that manages the survey panels. We ask Americans about their giving behavior over the previous week, and we aggregate that data on a monthly and quarterly basis to see what these trends look like and report on it on a quarterly basis.
Woodrow, is the data sample the same from one week to the next, or is it a different sample from one week to the next?
So it's a different sample. What we have over that 4-week roll up, we make sure that we're meeting quotas that to ensure that it is representative and that evens out any weekly volatility in the data. But it is a different sample each week.
If you could help us just take a little bit of a peek behind the data curtain, you have extraordinary expertise, but for our practitioners who are fundraisers, how do you do that difficult job of defining representative? You know, how many men, how many women, age generations, obviously racial demographics, all sorts of different ways that people identify. And of course, it's imperfect, right? You never know exactly with 100% certainty. And yet this is a reliable tool. So how are you defining which groups and how many as you do these surveys?
Yeah, so it is tricky, and you're right. We can't obviously be absolutely perfect, but we essentially use census tract data and try to match that as closely as possible by geography, gender, ethnicity, age. And then we can do a little bit more after the fact. We don't manage the sample, for example, for income, but the sample is big enough that we can then rework the data for other purposes and ensure that we have representative sample for things like income, if that's what we're interested in examining.
Wonderful. An earnest effort to really capture charitable giving in the United States. And how are you gathering the data? Are you calling people? Is it online surveys? Are you going man on the street, woman on the street, going up to people with a clipboard? How are these data being gathered?
Yeah, this is purely an online panel that's managed by the vendor we use.
All right. Well, what led to this? I mean, again, you strike me as a guy who, like, your data full-time job, when you relax, you probably have a hobby associated with data. Some people have a companion animal. Other people take up cycling. You love playing with data. What did you see? You know, what was the need and the opportunity that led to the GivingPulse?
I mean, partly this comes from the fact that I have a commercial marketing background, and we were trying to answer some questions at the GivingTuesday Data Commons about people's giving behavior, and we didn't really have the data flows to be able to do that. There are projects, in fact, some of which that we operate, like the Fundraising Effectiveness Project that we do in partnership with the AFP. There's things like the Lilly Schools panel, which is really, really valuable data. And then, of course, there's lots of reports that kind of look episodically at all of the ways that people are giving in their communities. But what we didn't have was what I've come to rely on as a commercial marketer, a kind of ongoing look at the values, the interests, and the response of everyday citizens at a really granular level, and that provides immediacy. And so to answer some of these questions and to broaden this view of what generosity is and how people respond, we needed to introduce a new mechanism. And so that's where we think the GivingPulse really fits in with all of the other tools that the sector is using, kind of somewhere a new space in between things like the ongoing panel at IU and FEP's look at specifically transactions, and even things like Giving USA that give us an annualized look at the overall giving spectrum. This was looking at trying to get a different feed, which is why we call it GivingPulse, an ongoing look at what is driving these behaviors and how they intersect and interact in a really immediate way.
And at the fundraising school, we encourage our participants, there's no such thing as the one perfect data set, the one perfect study. This is human behavior. It's very complex. All sorts of moving parts when we think about how people are interacting with one another in all sorts of ways. And so the GivingPulse adds to that opportunity for you to synthesize these different, reliable, valid reports that Woodrow has mentioned to help you with your fundraising planning. Now, Woodrow picked up a couple of times here this comment of we're trying to measure generosity. So not just charitable giving. Help us understand the perspective there behind the GivingPulse, that you're looking at all forms of generosity, not just charitable giving.
Yeah, I think that's really critical, is that people donating money to nonprofits is just one thing that people can do to express their generosity and have agency to make change. And in fact, it's the minority behavior. People are giving all of the time in their communities. They're not just giving money, they're giving lots of other things. And they're not just giving to nonprofits, they give directly to individuals, and they give to or through mechanisms that are often very structured and even what we would think of as kind of formalized, but not necessarily incorporated. Things like mutual aid societies that have existed for a long, long time. In fact, a lot of the mechanisms we look at predate the nonprofit sector by, millennia. And so if we want, even if what we care about in terms of outcomes is more participation or more money for the nonprofit sector, we need this broader understanding of how people are generous in order to meet them where they are. And one of the key things we've learned, because we now have these data, is these behaviors are not competitive. We definitely see substantial diversification of giving and donating, but this is a feature, not a bug. And if we understand this holistic opportunity, we recognize that there's actually abundance rather than scarcity. But we need to see we need to be able to measure empirically what this looks like if we're going to change our fundraising practices in order to be more effective.
So oftentimes the word philanthropy can be perceived to mean ultra wealthy, male, older, dead, Caucasian, all these different types of things. Generosity, Woodrow, has a broader meaning. It would really seem that with this tool, you're aiming to ensure that we are fully inclusive of all people, regardless of their backgrounds. And I know you don't measure particularly for income, but gathering all sorts of ways besides financial giving that people are generous, both in formal ways through nonprofit associations and informal ways as well. And so much is said about the continuing efforts to make sure we're diverse and equitable and inclusion and everybody's belonging through our nonprofit organizations. Seems like that's the philosophy behind the GivingPulse. Am I understanding that correctly?
100%. I mean, there's a lot of concern about reduced participation in nonprofit donations. And I think what GivingPulse has validated, we've certainly seen this from other sources, is that not everybody is being invited to participate. In fact, we see that when they are invited, they show up. And so if we want to break out of this kind of large donor stewardship focus, and it's not to say that we shouldn't be approaching all those donors that meet the qualities that you just outlined. I mean, sure, but at the exclusion of broader engagement is undermining of the foundation of support that we need for our nonprofits. It undermines our resilience and it robs everyday givers of their agency to make change. And what's really clear also when we started looking at these data is that it is as simple really as making that invitation. We've in our Q1 report of 2024, We even were able to estimate what we think the increased response rate would be just if the sector had been more inclusive of more people. We're leaving people out because we're chasing those high net worth donors at the exclusion of all others. And GivingPulse not only demonstrates that fact, but points the way to what we can do to change that practice to be more inclusive.
ROI and KPIs are definitely important to be accountable in our fundraising work. But when that is the sole focus, fundraising quickly becomes transactional instead of a highly inclusive approach that is transformational, including everybody, regardless of their income, regardless of gift size, or regardless of other ways they can be generous besides charitable giving. And the Giving Pulse is helping us see those opportunities. Now, Woodrow has mentioned the reports come out quarterly, so you need to every quarter check out what they're saying. Fortunate for us, they just came out with some new data in late September. Woodrow, what are some of the recent findings, which also then give our audience a sense of what they can see from the Giving Pulse from one quarter to the next?
Yeah, it's an interesting, and in some ways it's a disappointing quarter. What we saw was that giving across the spectrum of types and mechanisms were down in the second quarter. We saw a fairly strong Q1, or at least a steady Q1 coming out of the end of last year. And that was where we were able to kind of quantify what we thought the opportunity was if solicitation had increased. What is interesting, and I think really telling, is that we saw a corresponding drop in solicitation in the second quarter. And it's interesting, one of the things we saw in our data for years, including prior to launching GivingPulse and is validated by GivingPulse, is that generosity is generative. When people give, it actually opens them up to more opportunities. And that rather than being competitive, it really does seem these behaviors are mutually supportive. But that means the flip side is also true. When people are engaged less, they have fewer opportunities to give. What we see is that kind of drags down all forms of giving. That engagement, and we call it solicitation, but it is critical, as you said, not to think of this as transactional, but in fact as more of a dialogue, a conversation. But that lack of engagement, that reduction in solicitation, corresponds to a reduction in giving across all forms. Now, it's not massive, but it's a statistically significant downturn in generous behaviors in the second quarter, corresponding to less engagement.
And Woodrow's analysis is consistent with earlier research that we teach through the fundraising school. People ask us, well, how can I find new donors? And our first response is, who else is engaged with your nonprofit as a volunteer, providing some in-kind, advocating for your organization, helping put the word out, using their social media on your behalf? They're already engaged, and there's a good chance, if asked, they will contribute financially as well at whatever level they have the capability of doing so. Woodrow, where can we find this tool? Is it free? How do I get updates to know when the next quarterly report comes out? We really want to make sure fundraisers know how to access this excellent data and also the analysis that you and your team are providing.
So all the projects that we do and the data that we have and the reports that we release are available at givingtuesday.org/data. You can find GivingPulse itself at givingpulse.givingtuesday.org. And I should point out also that every quarter we partner with RKD Group to publish a field guide that really gets into, okay, what do you do with this data to improve your outcomes? And connected to what you said earlier, Bill, think differently about what KPI we actually care about. So we have the agency in this sector to reverse the negative trends that we see in donor participation, but it's up to us to do that.
GivingPulse.givingtuesday.org. Did I have that correctly?
That's it.
All right. So that's where you find the data. You can also learn how to access that RKD report that comes out because, again, these excellent data gathered objectively, representative sample from 1 week to the next, then aggregated from 1 quarter to the next. used with other research, including the information from your own donor database and your nonprofit's history in fundraising, can really be synthesized to help you with your fundraising planning. This is not a random process. This is not just take a charismatic fundraiser who's able to wave a magic wand and the resources appear. Instead, you can make data-driven, evidence-based decisions and planning for your fundraising success. And that is who we are at the Fundraising School in our 24 public courses that lead to now 5 different certificates. We teach in person or online in the United States and anywhere across the world. The same is true of our custom training, where we can take parts of different courses and knit them together specifically to meet your fundraising training needs. We have our quarterly webinars and, of course, this weekly podcast. All of our knowledge gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, now out in the book's 5th edition. All this information is available online at go.iu.edu/TFRS for the Fundraising School. Woodrow Rosenbaum, a delight to work with you today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise on the Fundraising School's podcast.
Thanks, Bill. It was a pleasure.
And our podcast produced today by the Emmy Award winner, Mike Anthony, and my CFRM colleague, Jennifer Boffman. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. Now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the Fundraising School.